Les poils étaient pignons, les vitons j'étais, et les jontons les hoppas, les chisons l'étaient, on pourra.
Ratatouille is not just my favourite Pixar film, it is in my top 100 after all, but I think it is quite honestly Pixar's best film. The only other two I'll even consider hearing an argument for is The Incredibles and Monsters Inc., but Ratatouille has been my favourite forever. Since I was a kid, this film captured me, and as I've gotten older, it's only gotten stronger, and since becoming a sort of YouTube critic, reviewer, whatever, some of the themes have become more potent. But before we get to all of that, I just want to talk about the production of this film a bit. Because what makes a film great isn't always about what's there on the screen, but what was there before. First of all, Brad Bird gets most of the credit for this film, and that's partially deserved, but the unsung hero of this film is a man called Jan Pinkava. He most famously wrote and directed the Pixar short Jerry's Game. He actually came up with the concept and designs of Ratatouille in 2000 and was initially set to direct it, but eventually he departed from Pixar and was replaced by Bob Peterson. But then he left the project to go and work on Up, leaving Pixar to turn to The Incredibles director Brad Bird, who wrote the eventual treatment, screenplay, and then directed the film. So though Brad had more than plenty to do with the film, Pinkava deserves to get his name out there when it comes to the credit of this film. Then once production actually started, incredible detail and attention went into the research and crafting of the film. For a start, gourmet chefs from both the US and France were consulted for the project to ensure the looks of the food were accurate and the general accuracy of the film's treatment of food, a kitchen, and the staff were on point. Which of course seems like an obvious thing to do and happens quite often in movie productions to do with a speciality such as cooking, but you have to remember, this is an animated film for children. That much attention and care was not necessary, nor was it expected. It really was an above and beyond step. Not to mention them going even further as to send the animators to culinary school so they themselves could not only understand the food in the kitchen, but understand the pressures and the ideas of a cook. They would become intimate with the scenery and feel of a kitchen, which informs their creative decisions more than you could know. That experience is invaluable. They also had a rat expert on site to consult, as well as pet rats in the office so they could study for behaviors and movement. And this was just an effort only old Pixar was willing to commit to. Ever since Disney acquired Pixar and slowly integrated their studios, the difference between the two has become less and less clear. When Pixar first jumped into the game with their first ever fully feature-length 3D animated film with Toy Story, and then had a batting average of 100% project after project, they shook up the entire animation industry. They forced Disney, who had dominated the animated sphere for decades, to change and keep up, and when they couldn't, they bought. Ratatouille came out a year after the Disney acquisition, but was in development for at least 3 years before and was probably the last remnant of a Disneyless Pixar. And I think it shows in the film. Before Disney took over, the films, especially those with Brad Bird at the helm, had this quality where they were animated films for children, but the content there for adults was a lot more abundant, and overall the themes and messages were a lot more complex and mature than other children's content at the time. Here we not only have the typical messages of friendship and trust and family and instilling decent values into children, but we also have a lot of conversation about art and what it means to be an artist, what it means to have value. And on the other end of the spectrum, what it means to be a critic and simply an audience member of art. Something not really explored in children's content because obviously children on average do not care about art. But Brad Bird, as do I, as do probably many people, think that children should learn the value of art. And not art in the sense of, paintings hanging up in the Louvre, but movies, things they can connect with, TV shows, things they'll grow up with, and then eventually, obviously, architecture and statues and paintings. Making kids care about these things from an early age lets them grow with these ideas and it becomes more instilled. I think this movie is very much a reason why I view art the way I do. It had a big hand in my development as a child, and as I've grown and as I've become an artist to a consumer to a critic to whatever, my opinions have always stayed pretty much the same. But it isn't just what themes they explore, but how well they explore them. For a start, the appreciation of art and the artist is best represented by the film's location, Paris. Now, of course, Paris is an inherently artistic place, but more than anything, Paris is an inherently romantic city. The architecture, the history, the language, the music, it all just screams romance. But anybody who's actually been there knows that it really isn't. It smells, it's dirty, and the general perception of Paris is far greater than Paris actually is. Which is kind of a metaphor in itself for art, but the perception of Paris is what's important, because as romantic as the idea of Paris itself is being romanticized, and this film uses that romantic feeling to romanticize food. The food in this film is not just something to eat, something to enjoy, but it's something someone creates for someone to love. Food, like movies, is art, and the way this film conveys the art and the way the artist views food is gorgeous. It makes this simple idea of a mushroom and a piece of cheese and rosemary look like a true inspired piece of passion. The film treats this idea's inception like Remy had just thought of painting The Last Supper, but of course the best scene beyond all of the cooking sequences that expresses this feeling of creation is when Remy is talking about creation when eating a strawberry and a piece of cheese. The visual storytelling is gorgeous, as well as the way the music helps fit it together. Using percussion to explain the one flavor but strings to explain another, and together they make jazz. It's done so beautifully, and the music overall helps soundtrack every emotion perfectly. Composed by Michael Giacchino, he puts his whole Giachussy into this score. I mean, the scene where Remy makes it to the top of the building and finds himself in Paris as the music swells is one of the most dramatically elegant moments in any Western animation ever. The heavenly Paris skyline, the revelation of being under his dream city this entire time, the music, the future now seeming so bright it's an all-timer. But the beauty of Paris and art and the artist and creation isn't the only message and theme, as we know. That's just one aspect. My favourite thread of the film is the idea of critics and criticism. This is mostly represented by the main antagonist of the film, Anton Ego, who was actually modelled after a vulture, which of course makes entire sense. Critics are often thought of as just vultures of art. They never create, they only pick apart, and are in general thought of very negatively. And that is definitely how this film starts out. The mentality of critics and their role in art is seen as a sort of impending doom situation, but by the end the film has a turnaround of the idea of critics and what their role actually is. You know, a critic isn't there to tear something down or pick apart an artist's creation. Lazy critics do that because it's easy. Their presence isn't to just destroy, it's there to uplift. You'll notice on this channel that I rarely ever talk about films I don't like. That's because I have very little interest in tearing down people's hard work no matter how awful I find it. I would rather send people towards art I admire than deter them away from art I don't, because the thing about art is it is definitely subjective, and what works for me won't always work for others, and I would hate to deter somebody from a film they might like because I didn't like it. That just doesn't seem fair, because art is for the individual, and this film has this realization with Ego himself, which is the turning point of the final act. After Anton challenges linguine, Remy serves him ratatouille, a dish commonly served to peasants and not respected critics, but the twist is that this dish sends Ego back to his childhood and completely transports his thoughts of Gusteau's restaurant. Because as we just said, art is for the individual. The dish ratatouille may not have worked for the next person or the person before. They might have enjoyed it, but it may not have struck a chord in the same way. Same way the film itself, Ratatouille, may not have worked for the next person as well as it did for me. They might have enjoyed it, but it just struck a particular chord with me. Because I may see a painting and see nothing but sloppy technique. You may see the same painting and see your last tragedy depicted as accurately as your memory will let you feel it. And this whole idea brings Anton to his final speech about the discovery and defense of the new, which is the best sequence in the film and one of the best monologues in animation history and easily the best in Pixar's history. This speech is of course aided by the fantastic voice acting of Peter O'Toole, who brings it on every single line in this film.
That is where I left it. That was my last word. The last word.
Yes.
Then tell me, Ambrister, how could it be popular?
But the rest of the cast are just as expertly placed. Patton Oswalt absolutely loses himself in the role of Remy, and for as distinct as his voice is, I don't get distracted by it at all. I only hear Remy. Ian Holm as Skinner is probably the most underappreciated casting in this film, but my favourite by very far is Will Arnett as Horst, who just makes me laugh with every single line.
I killed a man with this thumb.
Everything he says is so quotable, and this is one of the most quotable movies of all time as far as I'm concerned. Every time I eat Chinese food, I can't help but say the Chinesey line, the Symphony of Crackles line, the Rat Patootie line, I don't know. I just know this script back to front, and that's a true testament to Brad Bird's writing, which manages to be hilarious and joyful whilst also being sentimental and precise in its commentary. This, as well as the minor details and art direction, are just so incredible, like how Ego's room is shaped like a coffin, or how his typewriter is like a skull. The whole idea of them gaslighting Skinner is hilarious. The fact that rosemary is a herb and not a spice, and Linguini gets that wrong, even if it is semantics, just shows how out of his depth he is. Skinner's office still has Gusteau's name on it, signaling the restaurant's entire inability to move on, but also that Skinner is equally just riding that name till the wheels fall off. Gusteau is no longer a chef, but he's a brand. He's a symbol for his line of frozen and cheap foods. There's even a little detail where they hint that Gusteau himself might have had a little rat chef, but I think the truest testament to Brad Bird's writing is that the main duo can't even communicate. Not verbally anyway, and yet their conflicts and resolutions are always completely understood, and that's just masterful writing. There's also some underrated themes of this film that don't get quite enough credit, like the whole father angle. Both Remy and Linguini are trying to live up to their father's expectations, but both end up doing it in a way they didn't expect to. Also, the theme of change isn't talked about nearly enough when this film is discussed. There's a beautiful line where Remy's father is trying to tell Remy that humans are dangerous and simply can't be friends. It's the natural order of things, and Remy says, "Change is nature, the part we can influence, and it all starts when we decide." Which is just such a powerful sentiment to be put so simply. Remy doesn't want to live the life set out for him. Like many other great artists, he wants to create his own, even if that means disturbing the natural path. In one part, this is due to his determination and passion, and in another part, it's his ego, which he has an abundance of. There's that one scene where Gusteau is quizzing Remy about all the people in the kitchen and their roles, and we gotta remember that this isn't Gusteau's ghost, this is a figment of Remy's imagination. He's quizzing himself because he knows all the answers, he's just stroking his own ego because of the knowledge that he has. There's also one moment where Linguini is getting interviewed and Remy gets upset that Linguini doesn't credit him for his work, but there's no way Linguini could actually do that. And though this ego is a crux at times, it's also his greatest strength because it's the power that made him bold enough to cook that first soup. Ego is something a lot of great artists possess, and I'd go as far to say it's absolutely necessary. Linguini grows this ego before he's eventually humbled because he's not really an artist in that way. Colette has this ego, and it is absolutely vital to her because she's the only woman chef in the kitchen, and as she says, she has to be the toughest else she isn't taken seriously. The film is weirdly feminist, and I love that Colette isn't just simply a love interest, but she's a person of real value, and her opening speech about how hard it is for women to crack that industry, especially for back then, is very strong and just as relevant today as it was. However, it does seem like we've made some progress in that area since, but it is still a difficult thing for women to get into. And though there are a million things I'd like to talk about, because again, this is one of my favourite movies, period, I think I'm going to leave it on this. Brad Bird creates a story so incredibly involved in art and all its aspects, it's hard to not fall in love with it when you're involved with art in some way. The film's tagline, "Anyone can cook," is just a perfect summary of the film's ideology, and it's applicable to any field of creation, because as Anton Ego once so effortlessly put it, not everyone can become a great artist, but a great artist can come from anywhere. And just thinking about that line makes my heart inflate, and that's why I think this is easily the best Pixar film ever made. But that's just me. Have you seen Ratatouille? If so, let me know what you think about it. Let me know what you think of this video. I read every single comment and reply to as many as possible, and whether it's Pixar's greatest contribution to the animated industry or not, as always, keep watching movies.